And joining me now is CNN political commentator and Republican strategist Shermichael Singleton and Democratic strategist Matt Bennett. Thanks to both of you for being here this morning. Shermichael, let's just start first with what Harry was just walking Kate through. First of all, he touched on this, but those older voters are high-quality voters in the sense that they vote. So walk us through that. Also, why do you think Kamala Harris is doing better with them?
I mean, look, they do vote. They're older. They're more experienced. They've seen presidents come and go. They've seen good leadership. They've seen bad leadership. And so if you're a Democrat and you're making the argument that the former president is not the best individual to lead the country forward, then those individuals, because of age, because of wisdom, because of experience, may say, you know what, I think that's a palatable argument. I'm going to vote for the person making that argument. But there's some interesting things that I saw in the poll that I think may benefit the former president. We've talked a lot about women. With white women in particular, 50% for Trump, 47% for Vice President Harris. Can the former president increase those margins by 2 or 3%? That could certainly benefit him in a place like Pennsylvania. Another thing that I thought was very fascinating, we asked in that same poll, which candidate has policy positions on major issues that align with you? Donald Trump, 29%, to Kamala Harris, 18%. That suggests that the former president has strength that we're not necessarily seeing in some of the other polls that we saw in ours.
Matt, what do you think? Why do you think that Harris is so strong with these senior voters?
Well, I certainly agree with Shermichael's first point, which is these are voters that have seen a bunch of presidents come and go. They remember the chaos of the Trump years. And also, they pay a lot of attention to things like Project 2025, which really threatens the things that they care about most, things like Social Security and Medicare. They pay attention to when Trump talks about tariffs, across-the-board tariffs, 20% across-the-board tariffs, which they understand is just a tax increase on them. We did a study recently that shows that groceries alone would go up by $185 a year with those 20% tariffs. And all in, it's about $4,000 a year for an average family or senior. So they get that what Trump is proposing is very bad. And when they look at what Kamala Harris is proposing, they like it a lot more.
And you talk about the economy. It continues to be the issue in poll after poll that voters care about the most. They rank it the highest. We saw Vice President Harris, no big surprise, giving another big speech on her economic policy yesterday. And this is what she had to say in an interview following those remarks. I want to listen to this.
Well, part of it is you don't just throw around the idea of just tariffs across the board, and that's part of the problem with Donald Trump. Frankly, and I say this in all sincerity, he's just not very serious about how he thinks about some of these issues. And one must be serious and have a plan, and a real plan that's not just about some talking point ending in an exclamation at a political rally.
And Matt, you were just listing off some of the outcomes that you all had studied if those tariffs do go into place. And yet Trump continues in polling to poll higher with who's better, who do they trust more to handle the economy. Why do you think that is? And what do you think the vice president is doing enough to convince voters otherwise?
Well, I don't think they're reacting to Trump's plans. I mean, if they looked at it carefully, they would realize that if you wanted to go after inflation, electing Trump would be like treating your diabetes with ho-hos. I mean, all of his plans are inflationary. He wants across-the-board tariffs. He wants to deport 9 million people from an economy where we have basically full employment, which would drive up prices. So I don't think they're reacting to things that he's proposing. I think that they're looking back at pre-pandemic prices and thinking those were good, and why can't we go back to that? That didn't have anything to do with Trump. That's just the world that we lived in, not just the United States, but the entire world. And we live in a new world now. So I think it's understandable. But when voters pay attention to what Trump says at these crazy rallies, to Project 2025, and they compare them to what Kamala Harris is talking about, building the middle class, there's just no question that it would be better for them to elect Harris.
And Shermichael, I'll give you the last thought on this in terms of that economic message. He is polling better, but there are all of these studies that show that the plan he has would be bad for the economy.
Particularly with tariffs. Look,
Yeah.
the Biden administration, they maintain some level of Trump era tariffs, and I understand why. There's an argument to make that tariffs in some capacity could be a good economic strategy. I think writ large, if Donald Trump were to be reelected, I would imagine his advisors would say, Mr. President, there's a better way if we want to level the playing field with China, or if you want to stop an American company from shipping manufacturing to a country like Mexico. What's a better way to incentivize that company to keep those jobs in a place like Ohio? There's some different approaches there, and I think ultimately he would make that decision. But with that said, the guy is still ahead by about 8 points, I believe, in our recent poll on this issue. I think the vice president is smart to provide a critique and a differentiator between herself and the former president. But the issue for her is about 30+% of the American voters are saying, we still want to know where you stand on making the economy better. Providing a critique isn't enough. They need to hear more about the solutions, which is why the former president is still strong.
Well, and why she's still giving these speeches. That's what she's highlighting. All right, Michael Singleton and Matt Bennett, thanks to both of you.